Having completed and submitted my master's thesis at a time of urgency in terms of equality for Black lives, I am given the time to reflect on how my research could become applicable and useful to the movement that is trying to dismantle the embedded racism in all social structures and institutions that favour white skin. To gather and order my thoughts and to highlight the ways that we can apply knowledge to our everyday lives, I have produced this essay. My aim is to shine a light on one way we can take the necessary steps to combat institutionalized racism. This is one way of many possible tracks, but it demonstrates what can be done next once you've gathered knowledge of racism and decided to take a stand. The online social sphere is buzzing with ways to acknowledge white privilege, texts to use as tools for understanding the history of racism and white supremacy, and charities which you can donate your money to in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. This text here, however, will not signpost you to those necessary steps which can start your journey, but instead presumes you have an understanding of some of the key issues underlying the movement. If you feel that you still need to familiarise yourself more with the foundational discourse on racism, then I deeply recommend you using your online tools to find the relevant information. My hope here is to think about what comes next. Learning about the different manifestations of racism is not something that can be completed. It is an ongoing process that we can all work together to move through and beyond. My personal knowledge comes from educational courses at bachelor's and master's level in post-colonial theory, power structures and relations in society, and discourse on racial inequalities within social structures, particularly during our globalizing era. This is by no means a thorough examination of racism in all its shades, but it has provided me with the basic understanding that I can continue to grow and supplement. With this collected knowledge, I have the opportunity to begin critically analysing the structures that I am most interested in my personal life, and how my consumption and literary habits are impacted by the role of white supremacy. I am extremely fortunate to have a master's education and the free time to consider how I can best put my thesis to use in this political climate, and that is why it is necessary to share this as an open access think piece that can possibly be used to help others in working out where their journey to combating racism can go in the future. So now, let's take a look at a brief synopsis of my master's thesis. The title is Tales Told Through Translation, the art that fosters shared imaginaries between translator and ethnographer identities. It was submitted for my master's in Applied Cultural Analysis, and that's an interdisciplinary course that is part of Lund University's Ethnology division. It is generated from 3 months of fieldwork in which I was examining the lives and work of literary translators who translate into English and are mostly connected with the British publishing industry. Using qualitative data, I then examined and analysed the processes that my participants were talking about and looked at how they created translator identities and exercised cultural imaginaries of other places, and also the ways in which this reflected the shared nature of translation and producing an ethnography. My thesis did not examine race or post-colonial issues, as it was not something that seemed inherent to the data I had gathered, nor the scope of my thesis aim. In reflection, however, there is a very noticeable absence of the Black experience in the data and theory that I was using, and that absence says a lot. So, for the purposes of this text, I shall re-examine my data and demonstrate to you what we can learn about the racist structures that impact Black translators in the British publishing industry. First, I shall share a few disclaimers so as not to send out uncertain meanings. The knowledge behind this text is based on qualitative data, which is limited in its scope and was not intended to discuss race, so further research is required to gather a more full picture of the landscape that I'm examining. Also, due to the nature of this argument, there will have to be a few essentialist and generalised statements which I appreciate does not speak of every individual experience, but instead paints a picture of a majority experience. This does mean that there will always be counter-experiences, but such is the way that life works. This is a many-peopled world, and it would be impossible to demand each single experience is represented. And finally, this comes from 3 months of fieldwork and 3 months of writing a master's level thesis. It is not an extensive overview of all the issues at hand, but just the tip of the iceberg of what could be. And I am still learning, as are we all. I wish to extract the core issue that I presented in my thesis and examine this through the lens of racial inequality. The point is to look at the instability of literary translator identities as a profession, and how this is then amplified when shown through the systemic structures which support white people but not other people of colour. This is mostly controlled and perpetuated through language and education. Concluding this point, I will then go on to portray the things that can be done with such knowledge and how my master's thesis can then be applicable in this context. I hope to keep this brief and concise, so the points will appear more like an overview of my research, but I will consider at a later date how best to extend this argument to provide more in-depth analytical texts which can then be disseminated accordingly. So, we shall begin with an overview of literary translator identities. One whole chapter of my thesis argues that the professional identity of contemporary literary translators is precarious and uncertain for many reasons. The first is due to a history of translation in the UK, which adopts a specific style that has made the translators as invisible figures who are subservient to the original text and author. This is a well-argued point in many translation theorist articles and is currently being challenged in the industry with, for example, the Name the Translator hashtag, which is circulating online. Another factor which creates instability is the binary language instilled within the community, signified through the emerging versus established translator identity. There are vague boundaries between the two, and many translators find it hard to gauge where they sit in this binary, most falling in grey areas between or either side of the main descriptive points. This is then constituted and enacted in a further dividing way by the publishing industry that measures the identity more by published versus unpublished translators. Such binaries cause conflict, uncertainty, and promote inequality in various ways. As professional identities are by virtue a social identity, the process of creation of such identities is dialogic. One cannot define themselves, for it is a definition created in contrast to others, and by the definitions that others create for you. As such, the professional identity is something separate, but also deeply entwined with the personal identity of the self. Definitions which shape the translator identities often suppress individual identities, which can then be a challenge to reconcile. Looking at these themes, it becomes clear to see how these issues are amplified for black translators wanting to break into the industry. Translation in the UK has a very long history, and like most histories depicted in the UK, a very white history. This has given ample opportunities to create solid structures which favour white translators over their black counterparts. There's no surprise that the Black Lives Matter movement is continually fighting against the oppressive weight of history. In the data that I gathered, it was clear that literary translators who are most visible are white. Even when I attended a translator symposium in London run by the Society of Authors, of up to about 100 attendees, there were very few non-white people and almost no black translators in attendance at all. Well, why is this? The easiest answer is institutionalized racism, but this is something that needs to be broken down to measure a few of its most powerful restrictions. Translating is all about language, and there are myriad resources about the racial inequalities in language itself. Learning a foreign language can be difficult in the UK. It is expensive, so state-run comprehensive education that is consistently underfunded tends to not have as productive language learning classes. Access to the education which fosters strong language learning curriculums is a privilege predominantly afforded to white children whose parents can afford private education or perhaps happen to live within the most expensive catchment areas for the better comprehensive schools. Language learning outside of school is also expensive. Tutors, private lessons, travelling and having time to attend such classes are once again privileges seldom offered to black individuals because of the multiple ways that society oppresses them. So when translating requires a competence not only in English but also a foreign language, it is no surprise that most people with those skills are white because they're the ones who have been afforded the opportunities to gain them. It is also noteworthy that the majority of translators I interviewed or examined their online portfolios are educated up to and beyond master's level, often through highly acclaimed academic institutions, which once again brings us back to the problematic nature of racial inequality within education systems. It can be seen that a master's in translation is becoming more necessary in order to become a literary translator, or to at least demonstrate you have the knowledge and skill. So once again, we can see how education is being used as a way of perpetuating white supremacy. Until education is truly equal in the UK, then any career which relies on or promotes specific institutional qualifications will inherently be working against black people. But also, language is difficult in another way. There are countless stories from educated black people who are met with surprise because they speak English so well, as if it's not their native language. This shows an implicit supremacy that English is by virtue a language for white people, and Black Brits, whose native language is English, have to then work harder to overcome this unconscious bias in others. Also, black children from immigrant families, who may be speaking at home with a different language or a creolized language that blends two different forms, are consistently made to internalize a bias for the proper English which society dictates. The pressure that this creates in order to diminish the difference, as much as possible, leads to a suppression of another language in favour of a standardised English. To then expect these children of immigrant families to pick up another language, when we are constantly instilling the fact that they should be focused on speaking a proper English, is simply not fair. It determines a hierarchy of languages which once more favours white-sounding voices over anything that could be deemed too different. Native English-speaking translators are consistently having their language mediated by others. This is because of the style and understanding of translation that the British publishing industry has fostered, and is now reaching a peak of homogeneity as many large publishers focus globally. The main mediators of language, who aid the perpetuation of this homogenizing or neutralizing of language, are editors, and for much of the same reasons as stated above, it is safe to assume that the majority of editors, or at least senior editors with power over publishable language, are going to be white. As such, this helps to continue the internalized and socialized bias that we as a society have created. From my interviews, I have discussed how even regional accents or dialects are constantly edited out so as to lose any textual reference to a specific place. This may be deemed a necessary practice to truly capture the essence of the original text, but that is only because of how much this style of translation has embedded itself into our system. Not only does this diminish the sense of a personal identity as something that is too different from the centric ideal of how English should sound, nor is it only indicative of a privileged access to the right kind of English for education, but it also demonstrates the fear of difference that the translation process has, and how any deviance from this could be seen as revolutionary or fringe. This is something that is only permissible by independent publishers, who are specifically seen as designed to challenge the norms. But the norms should be challenged by all if we want the mainstream society to change too. The message that such language mediation sends out is that there is a proper English, and implicitly that says that there is a white-voiced English that must be written. When we consider the domestication of language in translation, we must acknowledge that domestication also represents whitewashing. Within this thread of my argument surrounding instability and uncertainty with translator identities, I noted in my thesis that this is something which came up regularly through my interviews. As these participants were predominantly white, it just shows how difficult it must then be for black translators to imagine themselves in such a position. The issues that may be faced by white minority translators need to be seen as tenfold for black translators. In order to reach those specific obstacles, a black translator first has to overcome many more. How can we expect translator opportunities to be taken up by black translators when even the act of imagining themselves in such a position can be seen as too exhausting, given everything that they have had to overcome first? Language is just one way that translator identities are constituted, but I believe that this above argument instills the breadth and scope of some challenges that black translators will face, alluding to even greater challenges in other facets of the profession. I want to now look at the role that globalization can play in the publishing of translation, how this impacts Black voices and opportunities, but also how this can be harnessed for promoting diversity within the field. Today, English language publishers now have power over multiple territories. The biggest publishers are distributing texts across national borders as they capitalize on global opportunities. Since the perspective of publishing and literary consumption is becoming more globalized, so is contemporary styles of translation. Translators work on texts for various distribution avenues, and this is one of the key arguments for the aforementioned need of mediating language. Translators themselves are also globalized, often traveling, sometimes accessing the countries they're translating from physically. This empowers their position as a translator, as I noticed that many translators have spent time living in the countries that speak the languages they translate. The nature of their competence through living in close proximity to the language is once more a privilege afforded to them for many reasons, the colour of their skin being one of them. Placing value in this form of experience as something to bolster opportunities for work creates additional inequalities and isn't necessarily needed. Access to other cultures through language is something that can be done remotely in this day and age, and physical time in a specific location does not always mean a deeper understanding of the language and culture it holds. Translators are subjective, as we all are, and are subsequently limited to their own perception and understanding of the world around them. But readers are then also subject to these perceptions, which can help to shape understandings of the world at large. And if we are privy only to a limited white view of the world, then this helps to continue the white-centric narrative that is being shared. There are lots of different theories on globalization, what it means and how it manifests. As we become more connected, there are many more obstacles that we all have to deal with. Publishing is facing many issues surrounding diversity, own voice literatures, and authority of representations. These are large cultural and social issues that can be philosophized to a great extent, but that does not mean we should trivialize or be afraid of confronting these issues in reality. As I regularly spend time reading up on trends and discourse in the publishing industry, I noticed that the above-mentioned issues tend to not be addressed within the field of translation, even though the act of translation itself is a serious matter involving precarious concepts of own voice and cultural representation. A good translator is aware of the limitations of their own subjectivity, and should be able to work around that with the tools collected through experience of their work. I do not believe that translators should then be limited to only translating texts that they have common experiences with. However, I do believe that creating a diverse range of voices within translation can begin to re-examine what translation today looks like, and enhance the richness of text and language with a cacophony of styles, interpretations, and non-standardized English. As mentioned prior, the publishing industry domesticates texts that are foreign. Translation is subsequently a form of perpetuating white English dominance. I interviewed a translator who did not identify as white, nor did they grow up in a native English-speaking country. This is a different experience to most translators, and represents what can be achieved by broadening the horizons of translator voices, which match the reality of the global world currently occurring around us. However, a translator like this has additional hurdles to jump over, as they must consistently present themselves as competent enough to warrant their work within the English language publishing sector. The way this manifests is through a translation of the self, which means a minority translator has to adapt themselves and their presentation to fit the desired image of what an English language translator looks like. This is an issue as it continues to allow structures of white supremacy to organize the way that minority people identify themselves in order to fit into the correct narrative voice. Without a change to internal structures, then popularized diversity quotas can only take us so far. At the moment, black narratives and black lives exist on the periphery of our white-centric societies. Whilst this may be seen as evolving through the publication of more black stories into the English language canon, we must also see how this can be developed in translation. Black translators are necessary to help alter the landscape of published translated fiction, and to help renegotiate the way that translation is enacted so as to be more inclusive for other voices. If black translators are still a fringe group of people within the publishing field, We need to see how this is then made a double exclusion when we consider the treatment of translation itself in the publishing arena. Translated literature has been ghettoized. It is not necessarily a part of the mainstream publishing industry, particularly the literary fiction scene, as it is always treated as something separate. English publishing still promotes national values over international ones, as it centres the narratives of national and white experiences. It does this through the various machinations and structures which make up the entire book industry. International book fairs make publishers focus more on selling the rights to their domestic texts as opposed to buying rights for foreign texts. The biggest national book prizes focus primarily on literature published in English. Those that focus on translated texts are an entirely separate prize, which continues to instill this sense of difference. Money is spent far more on marketing the next big nationalised book than any translated novel. Bookshops that promote translated literature, if at all, will always keep it on a separate table to highlight its state of alterity. The separation of translated literature can be seen to have positive effects, such as recognition at last of the work of translators, or highlighting the issues which contracts and payment of translators are facing. But mostly, separation like this continues to imply that translated fiction is something different, something fringe, and should be treated in a different way. This naturally helps to perpetuate inequalities. So if translators, who can then be considered a fringe collective of people in the industry, are predominantly made up of privileged and typically white voices, then what hope is there for black translators to even be noticed at all? Understanding these structures within the industry is the first step in finding ways of dismantling them. If the publishing industry values true diversity and supports the restructuring to allow black lives equal opportunities in the workplace, then these pervasive white benefiting systems need to change. On the one hand, this can be done with further research. I personally would recommend a thorough interdisciplinary analysis that values humanities research. Mostly, however, it needs to be achieved with appropriate financing and managing of resources to allow black translators the same opportunities as their white counterparts. This could take the form of scholarships for higher education in languages or translation. It could take the shape of language workshops for black youths, or it could take the shape of taking financial risks to promote other designs of translated fiction. Translated fiction is a window to the rest of the world, but the world doesn't look like us, and we should work on how our neutralizing of language is just another way of ordering the world to our own standards. Black translators can be a part of this change, and through providing more opportunities for them to find work, we should also provide the space in which they can experiment with form and language to reconsider just what translation could look like for a new way of seeing the world around us.